See, I like this design, but make him piss-colored. Super Sonic, he's Sonic, but he's yellow and really strong and cool, and I'm running out of adjectives. Ever since his introduction in 1992 Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Super Sonic has become a series staple. You collect enough rings, go to a portal that lets you play a little minigame. If you win, you get a Chaos Emerald, repeat that 6 more times, and boom. You're now Sonic, but you're also, as long as you keep enough rings in the tank for the rest of the stage. Super Sonic's gameplay has gone through a lot of different variations in the series over the franchise's expansive 30-year history. For example, how you obtain him. In some games, Super Sonic will be reached just through playing the story. In other games, he's entirely optional, being obtained by collecting the Chaos Emeralds if you choose to seek them out. Really just having him unlock an extra level or boss at the end. Or, he'll be unlocked by free DLC that they tried to get away with paying you for. But one thing has stayed relatively consistent. Like I said earlier, this Golden God Hog is fucking... Except for Sonic Unleashed, but we're not going to talk about that. As long as you keep your rings up and don't crash into anything, regular bosses basically can't touch you. Of course, bosses that require you to be supersonic can, but others can't. The main gimmick with these aforementioned supersonic bosses is that you will start off with a couple of rings, and you'll be required to get closer to the boss, making sure to grab any rings on the way, while also dodging the boss's attacks, which can lose you your rings if you do get hit. And then, once you're close enough, you can hit the boss as much as possible. The main gimmick is about simply preserving your rings. And while this system has worked fairly well over most of the games, then we make it to the open zone formula, and now there are some cracks. Let's talk a bit about Sonic Frontiers. Sonic Frontiers released on November 8th, 2022, and while it had your standard Sonic elements, it brought with it a lot of radical change to the series. The biggest thing, obviously, being that Sonic has gone fully open zone. While the linear point A to B type levels still exist via cyberspace, open zone is now the main formula for the series, which also meant Sonic's gameplay needed a bit of a shake-up. That homing attack plus boost combo has served Sonic well, but it simply wasn't cutting it anymore. It's time for some new faces. In Frontiers, Sonic, and later on in the Final Horizon, Tails, Knuckles, and Amy, received a full combat overhaul. Parry, side loop, skill tree, etc., you name it, they included it. Sorry, they didn't include that. They forgot to include that. Yeah, a big thing about Sonic Frontiers' combat is that it wasn't the best. It's pretty infamous for going for style over any sort of substance, which becomes a major detriment for it. As Sonic, you run around the open zone and you run into enemies, either just regular ones or these guardians, which are basically just mini-bosses, and pretty much every enemy can just be defeated with the homing attack. There is no reason to do different moves. Now, we're not here to talk about Sonic's boring regular form, ew, no, absolutely not. But I bring this up because these issues with the combat seep into Super Sonic's gameplay as well. Frontiers has these things called Titan Fights. There are 4 in total, basically one for each of the islands excluding Raya. These Titan fights serve as the final boss of each of their respective islands, and so you play as, who would have guessed, Super Sonic. Once you grab the final emerald off the top of the Titan's head, you go super, and that's where the fight starts. Now, real quick, let's break down the main gameplay aspects of these fights. You, as Super Sonic, have to race against the clock to defeat the Titans. Run out of rings, fight's over. The fights, in quotes, basically consist of you spamming whatever your strongest attack is, and absolutely obliterating the health bar of the Titans. You sometimes might have to do something before you can attack, but most of the time it's fairly simple stuff other than Night, which honestly, Night is just some fucking bullshit. Similar to prior games, Sonic cannot take actual damage here. Your focus is on preserving rings. However, you can't actually lose those rings. Well, okay, you can, by the timer ticking down as the rings are your timer, but that becomes a non-issue if you focus on upgrading your ring storage, and even then, 6.5 minutes isn't exactly no time at all, and that's what you start out with. If you max out your storage, which is very easy to do by the way, what with Big's fishing breaking the game, and even just killing enemies can get you plenty of items, you can get that ring count up to 16.5 minutes, so the timer isn't even a problem anymore. This also isn't accounting for the fact that, specifically during Wyvern's fight, which is arguably where you can waste the most time, rings will appear while you're flying, so it can take even longer than 16 minutes. The biggest problem with the Titan fights though is that they are absolutely piss easy. A 5-year-old child could beat these, I'm not even kidding. Because you can't take damage, a health bar isn't a concern, and because you can't lose rings by being hit, that's not a problem either. Your main worry is just the clock, but again, like I just addressed, the clock quickly stops being a concern if you focus on leveling up your ring stat. So what results is a lot of really cool spectacle with very little actual difficulty involved, which is obviously a major issue when those Titan fights are meant to be the main story boss fights of the game, so that brings a problem. How do you keep the thrilling combat and hype-inducing spectacle of Sonic Frontiers' supersonic segments, while also still providing a level of challenge that satisfies those looking for supersonic star aura farming, and those looking for a genuine gameplay experience? Now, you could just argue, well, simply bring back the mechanic where Sonic loses rings when he takes damage. Here's my counter-argument to that. Could you imagine during the Wyvern and Knight fights, at the part where you are getting bombarded with missiles, they made it so you could suddenly lose rings? Do you understand how genuinely horrible that would be? And, okay, you could then argue, well, nerf the amount of rings Sonic loses when he gets hit. But unless you make it something like 10 rings, which even then is honestly a lot, especially if you're getting hit constantly, which, while not too big of a problem in most Frontiers Titan fights, if they keep up this formula and make the fights more chaotic in the next game, yeah, that could definitely be an issue. Regardless of that though, I do feel like the answer still lurks within the rings mechanic. So first, let's actually discuss the rings, and then I'll go into my proposal for Supersonic's gameplay. Rings! You know rings. They're in pretty much every piece of Sonic media you can think of. From as far back as Sonic's very first game in 1991, rings have always served as what is basically Sonic's health. No ring, you die. Ring, you get an extra layer of protection that allows you to take more hits than you usually would. And if you get 50 rings, you can turn into the almighty Supersonic. Rings are Sonic's energy, or health, or something along those lines. This has been their purpose since the beginning, and will probably always be their purpose. But they've also begun to take on other roles. Rings are also a viable currency, and more recently with the Sonic movies and a surprisingly Sonic Crossworld, which I've really not seen anyone mention, rings are now a form of transportation, which from what we've seen can take you across planets, but it's also likely they can probably traverse full universes. Now, I want to specifically focus on the currency and energy parts of what I just said. I want to adjust the rings to not just be a timer, but a representation of Sonic's super energy overall. My goal is to keep the rings system balanced and understandable for new and old players, while also still providing challenge to those in search of it. So enough yapping, it's finally time for me to talk about what I actually think should be done about this rat's little god mode and its gameplay. I want to preface this with a couple of notes before I properly get into my idea. It should obviously be clear that this is nothing more than a concept and a mere suggestion, not something that Sonic Team should 1000% do, and should only listen to my ideas because everyone else's ideas suck, and if they don't listen to me, Sonic can die and I hate Sega. No, it's nothing like that. My main point in mentioning this is that, as is its nature as a concept, stuff can be adjusted and changed depending on feedback. It's also worth noting that if you do have criticism of this idea, please be respectful about it. Sorry, but I'm not going to bother conversing with people who want to be assholes. It's not worth my time. Regardless, let's get into it. My main idea is to take the ring system and turn it into something you can also attack with. Now, in order for fights to actually last a while, I'd increase the ring cap significantly during super fights. By how much? That's something that would definitely be hard to figure out. It definitely be in the thousands though. For the sake of the concept, and this is going to sound insane, but just hear me out for a second, I will go with 50,000. In order to keep the timer still a threat that you have to worry about, you'll lose 25 rings a second instead of just 1 per second, which should be around 33 minutes worth of time, excluding what I'm about to explain, which will change things dramatically. So how would you attack? Well, I'd make Supersonic skill tree separate from Sonic's, and you'd unlock more moves via story instead of regular game progression. And there's also a catch to attacking. Attacking would now cost rings. You'd start off with 2, technically 3 attacks, each assigned to 1 bind. For this example, I'll use the example of an Xbox controller. One of them obviously being your regular attack that you could mash with X, and then the others, B and Y, would both have their own dedicated attacks. There would also be other attacks you could get later throughout the story that would take up the A button, the triggers, etc. Each of these attacks would cost a different amount of rings, and the main flow of gameplay for these fights would resolve around using the most efficient moves to take out the enemy, while also being careful to keep your ring count in mind. Your regular attack button, X, would also cost rings, although it would be the cheapest, being a measly 10, it'd also do the least damage. You could then sprinkle it in with your B and Y. B would be in the middle, being 25 rings, and the medium attack in terms of damage. and Y at the max with 35 rings but the strongest. While your ring count would increase between each boss fight, so would the cost of attacks. For example, in boss fight 1, B is 25, then in boss fight 2, B might be 35 and Y might be 50. Also, obviously, the amount of rings you lose per second would also increase. I'd also put a limit on how much you could spam a single attack via inflation. The more you press an attack, the more rings it takes to use. This increase will be temporary, but it makes sure the player is switching up their moves instead of just spamming the strongest one. The main goal of all of this is to encourage proper strategy, genuine difficulty, and most importantly, capitalism. I won't lie and say this is a perfect solution, there's definitely things you could tweak and work out, but I do think this would be a fun idea to try, and it'd also give people motivation to try out different attacks. See what's the most efficient, what's the least amount of rings you can lose during each fight, ranged or melee, etc. If you do not defeat the enemy within the ring cap, like always, you would die and have to restart. I'd also probably make it so you wouldn't be able to replenish rings during the fight, similar to Supreme, Knight, and Giganto. However, it depends, and I think if it's a case like Wyvern where you are flying around the entire arena, I think it's fair to have rings placed around. Essentially, the way I would see the fights going is you become Supersonic, you are given an increase from 1,000 to 50,000, you lose 25 rings per second, but the more attacks you do, the more rings you lose, which can add up very quickly, making the player have to figure out what it is they need and what they should prioritize. The biggest issues here are what you do with the parry and the Psyloop. Personally, I'd have the parry be the only thing that doesn't cost rings or energy, as I believe that's a little too unfair and honestly just pointless since you lose rings if you don't parry anyways. The main change with the parry that's needed is just the timing, which even Sonic Team is aware of, even if they totally overcorrected it in the Final Horizon. With the Psyloop, it's definitely a lot trickier, although I honestly don't see the Psyloop staying past Frontiers anyways. I'd say the Psyloop could probably be free, or at least very cheap, but the quick Psyloop would be probably very expensive, arguably 150 to 200 rings, probably a whole lot more considering how unbelievably busted it is. Even 200 feels cheap, so I'd honestly probably just nerf the quick Psyloop on top of its high price. All in all, I do believe this system would provide a lot more depth to each fight instead of just having to wait to spam your strongest move. Supersonic segments in Frontiers are very fun, but they definitely lack that challenge and gameplay spark that previous games have not really had much of a problem with. Boss fights are meant to be a test of the player's skill, which I think Frontiers really lacks in that aspect, at least in base game. And even then, with the end in the Final Horizon, the reason that fight has any challenge to it at all is because the game does not effectively communicate what you're actually meant to do, making it less challenging and more just confusing. If the fight were to properly signal what you're supposed to be doing, it'd basically be just as easy as the fights in the regular game. There are a lot of ways you can improve upon Supersonic's combat, and this is what I think would be a good idea to try, but this is only one idea of what I assume probably many people have thought about and put their own spin on. And if there's one thing the Sonic community is known for, it's not being able to agree on anything. Now, before I get tons of people telling me how I know nothing about game design, I'm going to end it off here and go play Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition, even though the game is not actually even out at the time of me saying this, which is exactly why I'm going to publish this after it has so I can give you content while I run away playing Peak. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.